I think it is time now to record about my senior year in high school. And the first event that I remember that fall was the county fair and rodeo. And I especially remember it because my daddy was superintendent of the fair and rodeo that year. I think it was sponsored by the Rotary Club, and they selected him to be the superintendent that year. And I remember after school every day for some time before the fair started that I would go out to the fairgrounds with my daddy to check on things. Now, the fairgrounds had been built on land just west of town on a little slight hill. And earlier, two nice rock buildings had been built. I think they were built by some organization. I forgot, it seemed like the NYA or something like that. It was an organization to help young people, and they had built those buildings. And I think one was for the exhibit of dairy cattle. Johnson County, our county, was supposed to be a center for dairy cattle. And the other building was for exhibits by housewives, exhibits of food items that they had made and other things that they had sewn or made with their hands. So Daddy would go out to be sure the booths were built in that building and that the stalls were built in the other building for the cattle. And I just loved going out with him to see that everything was prepared. And then, just before the fair started, I got to do the neatest thing. And I'm sure it was because my daddy was the superintendent. But I was chosen with a boy to ride our horses in front of the high school band as they marched up and down the field before the football game started on Friday night. That was the neatest thing I could think of in those days. I had never known of any horseback riders getting to ride with the high school band. And sure enough, this boy and I were asked to ride at the head of the band. And I didn't know how Prince was going to act with that loud music playing right behind him. I was a little concerned about it, but he acted perfectly, and I just loved getting to show off my horse and ride in front of the high school band right next to the flag bearers. And so we went up and down the field as it marched up and down. And oh, that was such fun for me. But then the next thing about the fair I didn't enjoy as much because I didn't get to use my horse. Somebody decided that it would be a good way to get interest from the little towns around Cleburne if they asked those towns to each select a princess to participate in our county fair. And I was elected to be the hostess princess, the Princess of Cleburne. Of course, again, it was because of my daddy, but I was thrilled to be the hostess as long as it didn't interfere with me riding my horse. And before the fair started, there were several parties for the princesses from the other little towns, and I got to be a hostess at all of those parties, and I enjoyed that. But then, when it was time for the fair, I didn't enjoy those events because they kept me from riding my horse. In the big parade that was the beginning of the county fair and rodeo, Anne got to ride her horse. Now that little baby horse, we called her a colt, which was really a boy horse. And her horse was a little girl horse, a little filly. We should have called her a filly. But anyway, Anne got to ride her little filly in the parade. And I didn't get to ride my horse in the parade because I had to ride on a float as the Cleburne Princess. And the Lions Club built my float and had a throne for me to sit up on a throne. But the neat thing was that they had 2 seats down below the throne for little attendants for me and my 2 little cousins, Linda and Sandra, who were probably about 4 years old then, got to be my attendants and sit at my feet in the parade. And I loved having them there. That was the only good thing as far as I was concerned. But as soon as the parade ended, Anne and I both wanted to get out to the fairgrounds as soon as possible because the horse show was right after the parade. And we wanted to ride our horses in the horse show and be judged. And so my mother was waiting at the end of the parade to pick us up and take us home and helped me change into my riding clothes. And my daddy got both of our horses, Anne's from the parade and mine from our lot, and had them trailered out to the fairgrounds waiting for us. But all of that took time. And by the time Anne and I got out there on our horses, the horse show was over. And we were so disappointed And Daddy told the judge that we had wanted to be in the horse show, and we were so disappointed. So he said, "Well, I'll just judge them right now." And he told us each to ride our horse down to a certain point and come back. And then he gave each of us a blue ribbon. Well, we knew that ribbon didn't mean a thing. And we were so disappointed that we had not been able to be in the horse show. And that night, I think Ann got to ride in the grand entry at the rodeo. I'm not positive about that. But I know I wanted to ride in the grand entry so bad. But instead, I had to fulfill my role as the Princess of Cleburne. And I had to ride around the rodeo arena sitting on top of a convertible and had to be in a long dress. I had to wear a long dress in the parade too. I forgot to say that. So I rode all around the arena, and then the car stopped in front of a platform where I got out, and we had a special place to sit on the platform. And each of the princesses from other towns then rode out on the top of convertibles, and they came in and sat on the platform. And I don't remember how the queen was selected. I just know that, that I was not allowed to be considered for the queen. It was just from one of these visiting princesses. And one of them was chosen queen at the rodeo and crowned while we sat around her. So that was the first night of the rodeo. And then I remember a little later that week, I guess it was a Friday afternoon, they were going to have a session of the rodeo for children in the afternoon. And two men came to the high school and asked the principal to let me out so I could participate in that children's version of the rodeo. Not children's version, but the version of the rodeo that was presented for children. And so I was allowed to leave school that Friday afternoon, and that part was real neat. But then I was told that they wanted me to carry a flag in the grand entry of that performance of the rodeo for children, and that they were getting a boy to carry the other flag on his horse. So my daddy trailered my horse out there, and my mother hustled me home to put on my riding outfit. Now, by then, they had been able to get a really nice cowgirl outfit for me, and boots and a cowboy hat and everything to go with it. So I was real happy to get that outfit on, And then Mother rushed me out to the rodeo arena where my horse was waiting. And these men who were operating the rodeo told me and this boy that we were to carry these flags, and he told us how to do it and where to ride around the arena and go around twice and then stop in the center at the side of the center of the rodeo and wait then for the officials to be introduced and ride up by us. Oh, I thought that was going to be so much fun. So we started out, but I had just gotten started and I looked over and the boy's horse was rearing up and jumping all around. And so the boy just turned around and went back to the gate. And I felt like that I wasn't supposed to go on without him. So I turned around and went back to the gate too. And then we started over. Well, this time when we started over, his horse did behave, and we made it around the arena and got to go through the procedure like we were supposed to, and that was fun, and I enjoyed getting to do that. And of course I knew I just got to do that because of my daddy, but I was very happy to get to do it. And that's about all I remember about that rodeo and fair that year. The next big thing I remember my senior year was breaking my ankle again playing tennis. I think that I took tennis in PE every year I was in high school to try to avoid having to play baseball. Now, I still had to play baseball part of the time, but most of the time I got to play tennis. And I broke my ankle again. I had done it as a freshman, and now as a senior, I broke it again. Well, this time, the doctor put me on crutches. And you see, my classes were on different floors of the high school, and I would have to go up and down between every class to a different floor. And I didn't know how in the world I was going to handle that on crutches. And Morris Bratton came to my rescue. Now, Morris's sister was in my Campfire Girls group, and she had told me sometime before that her brother told her that I was his girlfriend, but that he could never get over to my house to see me because he played football and they practiced till dark every day and all day on Saturday. And after that, his dad picked him up and took him home, and he never had the use of the family car. They lived in far North Austin, far, far away from us. And on Sunday, they went to the Methodist church, and they were even more conservative than my family. And they went to church morning and at night time, and in between, they had to stay at home. So he had no opportunity to come to see me, she said, but he considered me his girlfriend. Well, when I broke my ankle this time and was on crutches, Morris came to the rescue, and I don't know what I would have done without him. He was wonderful. He would get someone else to carry my books each time, and he would help me up the stairs to keep me from falling on the crutches. He would go right along holding on to me and helping me. I still remember how wonderful he was. No boyfriend could have been more helpful. And I just appreciated him no end and was so thankful to have Morris as my boyfriend. And he was a real good-looking boy. A very good student. And they had a good citizenship honor roll every month. The school made up a list of 6 students who were the best citizens that month. And every month I was on that honor roll, and Morris was on it every month. So he and I were the two considered the 2 best citizens among the students. And I really liked Morris, and he was such a good-looking boy and so sweet and good. And I was so happy to have him as my boyfriend, even though I never got to go out with him or have him in my home. And I only got to be around him at school. So when I had that broken foot as a senior, broken ankle, he was the one that made it possible for me to go up and down the stairs, and he was absolutely wonderful. So that was a big thing that year for me. And then another big thing that year, which I remember, was the senior play. Now, there was so little entertainment in Cleburne in those days that the senior play was always a big deal. And the auditorium and the balcony in the big auditorium in the high school was always full of people. People that had no kids in high school, but were just coming for the entertainment of the senior play. And so it was a real big deal. And it was an interesting way of doing it. I don't know where they got this idea, but for many years, long before I got into high school, I remembered hearing about the way they did the senior play. They had 2 different casts who played this play. And one cast would give it on Wednesday night, and on Thursday night, a different cast would give the same play. And then on Friday night, it was presented again, and that time with the characters which a group of faculty members had chosen, had been the best ones in each role on Wednesday and Thursday nights. So the best in each role performed together on Friday night. So the play was presented those 3 nights, and it had been done that way for many years. And I can remember when I was a freshman in high school thinking, oh, when I get to be a senior, I want to be in the senior play. That would just be great. That was even more exciting to me than graduating from high school. And sure enough, when they started interviewing students to be in the cast of the senior play, I was chosen for the lead role in one of the nights on Wednesday night. And we had to stay after school every day for weeks practicing. And I can remember that in this play, the boy who had the lead role was supposed to kiss me. And all the students kept teasing about, was he really going to kiss me? And that was a big to-do, and it was so funny they made such a big deal out of it. And then I remember when the time finally came, after weeks and weeks of practicing, on a Wednesday night, we performed the play. And sure enough, the boy did kiss me, just kind of like a peck. But anyway, we did our part for our cast of the play. And then we watched it being presented on Thursday night with a different cast. Both times the auditorium and the balcony were filled. And many of the people were just people from the town that had nobody in high school. So the play was given those 2 nights, and then a group of faculty members were supposed to choose the people who had performed the best in each role and make that choice on Friday morning and announce it at noon on Friday. Oh, I wanted that so bad. I just thought that would be the heights of everything if I could be chosen for that role on Friday night. And so I didn't go home to lunch that day because they were going to announce it at noon. I usually went home to lunch. And I remember when the faculty member got up and announced, and sure enough, I had been chosen to play the lead role for Friday night. And I was so thrilled and so excited, I hardly knew what to do. But there was a problem. I was losing my voice. I had developed a sore throat. And probably because we had to talk pretty loud when we were performing the play. So at noon on Friday, my throat was hurting to beat the band, and I seemed to be losing my voice. And yet it had just been announced that I was to have the role I had been wanting since I was a freshman in high school. Oh my gosh. So I phoned my mother and told her I'd gotten the role, but I was losing my voice. And she came down right away and drove me to a doctor. And fortunately, there was a new throat doctor in Cleveland that had just recently opened up there. She took me to him and told him the situation, and he was so good. And of course, he was wanting to develop a reputation in Cleveland. So he worked really hard with me. He kept me there for several hours on Friday afternoon. I just didn't go back to class that afternoon. And he kept me there working with me. And every once in a while giving me some kind of medication. And you know, he enabled me to keep from losing my voice. And I got to perform in the play that night. And I was thrilled to death. I thought that was the height of my life. And it turned out really good. And the boy kissed me. It was a different boy. It wasn't the boy whom I had played the role in the first time. It was the boy from the Thursday night play that had been chosen as the best one. So I had a different person opposite me Friday night. But it just worked out beautifully. And everybody seems very happy with the way the play went. And I was in seventh heaven. As far as I was concerned, that was as important as commencement. And I remember after that play ended on Friday night, I felt like I had graduated from high school. I felt that I had done the ultimate. So that was how important the senior play was in our high school. Now, another thing, though, that I remember was our senior theme. Just like in the 7th grade, we had to write a senior theme, and this time, the five best senior themes were read at commencement. Now, we had 2 nights of commencement, and one was considered as important as the other. And the auditorium and balcony were packed with each one of them. Now, the first night of commencement, 7 of us, no, it was 5 of us. I can't remember whether it was 5 or 7 of us that had been chosen to read our senior themes that night. And they had us practice reading them ahead of time because the auditorium was so big and we had to do it over a microphone. We had to get used to using the microphone. And so I remember that that senior theme was so important. And of course, I wanted to be one of those chosen to read mine, just as I wanted to be chosen as the lead in the senior play. And the subject of my term theme was Christianity in America. And after I wrote it, my daddy suggested that I take it to Dr. Arnold, our minister, and ask him to read it to see if he felt it was all correct, that all the information was correct. So I did, and he said he thought it was really good. There was just one error in it, and that was that I had mentioned something that was infrared. And I had said infrared, and then in the next sentence I said, and that read such and such. And he said, infrared is not red, not the color red. And he said, my teacher should have caught that, but didn't seem to know that infrared was not the color red. So he had me change that wording, but he said all the rest of the theme was real accurate and real good. So I was happy about that. And so sure enough, my theme was one of those that was chosen. And we had to practice, like I said, practice ahead of time, reading them, standing at the podium and reading over the microphone with that big auditorium and balcony that extended way up. And that was all very exciting to me. And I just remembered that I forgot one thing I wanted to include about my senior year. And that has slipped my mind again, but I'm sure it will come to me. So I will go on with where I was. And so the first night of commencement was the reading of those themes. And I can remember I was very nervous that day. And I received a telegram. It was the first time in my life that I had ever gotten a telegram. And it may have been the only one I ever received. I can't remember receiving any others. But this telegram was from Dr. Arnold, our minister. He was in General Assembly, and he sent this wire to tell me he was sorry he could not be there to hear me read my theme, but he knew that I would do real well. Oh, that helped me so much. I'm starting to cry. I just remember how I thought that was so wonderful that he was in some city in some other state in a big meeting, and he had taken the time to send me a telegram wishing me well. And so that helped so much with my nervousness, and I did get through it all right, reading my theme, and my parents seemed to be very proud, and that pleased me because my whole purpose in just about everything was to make them proud of me. And then the next night, we had the second part of commencement, and that's when the diplomas were given. And so we got our diplomas. And then they announced the best citizen, the boy and the girl who had won the award as best citizen during their high school career. Well, I had been nominated on the good citizenship roll every month that I was in high school. So I felt sure that I would get that award. No other girl had been nominated as many times as I had. And Morris Bratton, my boyfriend, had been nominated the most times for the boys. And I expected him to get the award for the boys. So the time came to give out the prizes, and the boy was announced first, and sure enough, Morris got the prize. And I was so happy for him and so proud of him. And then they announced the prize for the girl, and I was getting ready to stand up. And lo and behold, they did not call my name. They called the name of another girl. And I couldn't believe it. She had been on the good citizen roll several times, but not near as many times as I had. I had been on every month. And I could not understand what had happened. And I just felt heartbroken. And I remember after the program, my friends were all so excited because we had graduated. And several of my friends were going out to eat somewhere, and they invited me to go with them. And I was so disappointed about this. I felt like I had let down my parents because I wanted to be selected the best citizen for my parents to make them proud. And so I didn't want to go out with my friends. I told them that I just wanted to go home with my parents after graduation, and I did. Now, I forgot to say that Morris had sent me a corsage to wear with my cap and gown. It had been the custom occasionally for a few boys to do that. Not very many, but a few girls did get to have corsages, and they let us wear them over our gowns, commencement gowns. And I was thrilled to have that corsage, especially since I'd never been able to go out on a date with him. But I was thrilled to get that corsage. But then when they announced those good citizens, I was heartbroken. I felt like I had let down my parents. And I was so disappointed. and I couldn't even be happy about graduating. Now, I remember when we got home, my father talked to me and tried to help me accept and realize there was some reason that we didn't know that they had given it to this other girl, but that he knew I was a good citizen, and that was what counted. Anyway, about 3 weeks later, in the summer, a man, which our family knew but didn't know real well, phoned me and invited me to go with him to a meeting of the Lions Club. Now, it was the Lions Club that had given the Good Citizenship Award. And I felt uncomfortable going with him since I had not gotten their award. But my daddy said, of course, I needed to accept his invitation and go. So I did, and the man came and picked me up, I remember, and came to the door and got me and walked me to the car, and he was very nice to me. And he said, I want to explain to you before we get there why we did not give you the Citizenship Award. He said, we knew that you had the most nominations and that you deserved to have it. But your father belonged to the Rotary Club, and the Rotary Club were big. We were in big competition with the Rotary Club. And there was a member of our Lions Club who had a daughter who had had a number of nominations for the Good Citizenship Award, and who was one of the top students in the school, as I was. And so they felt that they had to give the Citizenship Award to this girl to please a member of the Lions Club, of their club. So it was purely a political reason. And so many times in my life, I was aware that I had received benefits because I was my father's daughter. But this time, I missed getting a benefit because my father belonged to a different club. And I'm starting to cry just thinking of it. But this man was so kind, explaining to me they knew I deserved to have the award, but they felt they had to give it to the daughter of their member, since she also had had a number of nominations for citizenship. And I was the daughter of a member of the Rotary Club, which were their rival club. And they had already made me their princess the first part of the year for the county fair. The Lions Club had made me their princess. And they felt like they just couldn't do anything else for me. So he explained it so nicely. And by the time we reached the club meeting, I understood what had happened. And they invited me into the meeting, and they said I was the honoree at the meeting. That they all, each week they met and had a luncheon, and that luncheon was in honor of me, they said. And they gave me a little prize, just some small thing. But they were so kind and so sweet to me that it made up in many ways. Not completely, but made up some for the hurt I had felt in not getting that prize. And it had meant that I didn't get to honor my father, which I'd wanted to do that way. So that was coming to the end of my high school career. But I remember now that I left out something that I wanted to tell. Earlier in the high school year, I remember that I had been chosen business manager of the high school paper. And I went around town asking businessmen to put ads in the high school paper, to pay us to put ads in our little paper. And that's how we paid for the printing of our paper. And I got lots of ads from businessmen. And then I would go back to school and make up the ads and put them in the layout for the paper. And I would take the paper down to the office of the Cleburne Times-Herald, our local paper, and have them print our high school paper for us. And they always did a real nice job. And then I handed it out to the businessmen, and of course all the students got it. So that was a big deal for me. And I remember once when I was going around asking for ads, I went to the other bank. Now, there were two banks in Cleburne, and they were both on a block across from the courthouse. They were a block apart. The bank where my daddy worked was owned by the Moody family in Galveston, as I think I said way back earlier in my recordings. And the owner of the other bank in Cleburne was the Hobby family in Houston. And the Hobby family owned the main newspaper in Houston, while the Moody family owned the main newspaper in Galveston. And of course they were competitors. Well, I knew the vice president of the other bank, Mr. Custard. And I always went to Mr. Custard to ask for an ad for the school paper, and he always gave one to me. And I remember once when I went, he said, "All right, I'll give you the ad." And he said, "Now I want to introduce you to somebody." And he took me to the back to his private office And there was Governor Hobby. He actually was the ex-governor. He had earlier been governor, but he was one of Texas' leading citizens at that time. And Mr. Custer introduced me to Governor Hobby. And Governor Hobby was just so gracious. And he asked me to sit down, and he wanted me to tell him all about what I was doing. Of course, Mr. Custer told him first thing that I was the daughter of Mr. Abbas, and so he knew that I was the daughter of their competition. And I knew that Mr. Custard was introducing me to show Governor Hobby that he was a good citizen. And even though the other bank was their rival, that he was being a good citizen and being good to the other bank. I knew I was being used, but I still just loved the experience and getting to meet Governor Hobby. And he sat there and asked me so many questions about my life and told me so many things. And at that time, his wife, Ovita Culp Hobby, was in Washington starting the WAC program, the Women's Auxiliary Corps in Washington, and she was one of the most prominent women in the United States at that time. So I just felt so lucky to have Governor Hobby spending all that time with me. And I knew it all was all because Mr. Custer was showing off. But I still took advantage of it and enjoyed it fully. Enjoyed it to the fullest. Now, there was another thing that happened when I took those walks around the business district asking businessmen for ads for the school paper. One time, I saw in a very small office a sign that it was for a Republican running for president. The Republican's name was Wendell Willkie. Well, Cleburne was all of Texas at that time were huge Democrats. And we didn't even know, I didn't even know what the Republican Party was, because Texas was just full of Democrats. And my daddy was a leading Democrat in Cleburne. And he told me that the reason he was so strong for Roosevelt was that he felt Roosevelt had saved the banking business and had therefore saved his job. He had been with 3 banks that had failed in the Depression, and Roosevelt had saved the banking business. So he was a huge fan of Roosevelt. And we had signs for Roosevelt all over our belongings. There was even a sign for Roosevelt on our front door. So anyone who came in the front door saw it at home. So We were the big Roosevelt fans. But I thought this sign for Wendell Wilkie sounded interesting. And I was not trying to go against my father at all. I was just curious. And I went in and asked for some of their literature. And I took it home and read it. And I thought this Wendell Wilkie sounded really good. So I decided that I was in favor of him for president. And I went back and got a lot more of that literature and brought it with me to school. Now, in our American history class that year, we had to write a theme about the election that was coming up. And the professor, our teacher, Mr. Young, expected all of us to write about Roosevelt. And we wrote our themes, and they were like campaign pieces urging people to vote for the candidate that we were promoting. And everybody in the class, of course, was promoting Roosevelt. Everybody in town did. And then it was my turn to read my paper. And I had written my paper on Wendell Wilkie. And I had gotten literature from there, which I passed out to all the students. And my theme was really a campaign thing, campaigning for Wilkie. Well, immediately after that class, my teacher, Mr. Young, said he had to see me after school. And I went in to see him, and I knew he was mad. He was absolutely furious at me. And he said, "Don't you know that your father is one of the leading Democrats in this town, and you have just insulted him by promoting Wendell Wilkie?" And he said, "I'm giving you a 0 for that thing." And he just lashed into me over and over about what a terrible thing I had done. I had insulted my father, and he tried to break down everything my father was doing. Well, he had me crying, of course, and I went home crying. And I told my daddy everything that had happened. And he comforted me. He hugged me and comforted me. And he said that he was proud of me for thinking for myself and for standing up for something I thought and not just accepting what I knew he thought. Oh, God, that made me feel good. That made me feel so much better. And, of course, it made me appreciate my father so much. And that was always his attitude about everything. That he wanted me to think for myself and make my own decisions as much as possible. And Mr. Young never got over that. He was mad at me for the rest of the year. Just like Miss Gray had been mad at me during high school because I hadn't taken her Latin class. But with both of those men, I knew it was because of my daddy that they were so mad at me. They wanted support from my daddy and wanted to give praise to my daddy and felt like that I was insulting my daddy by doing something different. I went back and told Mr. Young what my daddy had said. He said, well, he was just trying to get me to stop crying. And he still thought I was a terrible student for doing that. So that was one of the negative things that happened to me in high school. And now I can't remember anything else about high school. Now, I'm probably leaving out something that I will think of later that I want to mention. But this is all I can remember now. And so I'm going to move on to the summer after my senior year in high school, after I had graduated from high school. And the first thing that happened after that was Campfire Girls Camp. And my daddy this time was able to rent the camp that we had used the first year of our camping, the first year of Campfire Girls in Cleveland. And we had had such a successful camp there then. And so we were very happy to have it again. And the year before, our group had been called junior counselors, but we really didn't do much. But this year, this last year in high school, when we went to camp right after school, our role as junior counselors was expanded a great deal, and we had a lot of responsibilities helping with the camp and helping with the younger kids. Now, there were two big things. One was I had heard about some of the girls in Waco taking their horses with them to camp. And I thought that was absolutely the neatest thing. I'm going to have to stop and take a drink. I thought the idea of taking one's horse to camp with them was just about the neatest thing I'd ever heard of. And I asked my daddy if I could take my horse. Well, my daddy did most of the things that I asked for. And so he talked to the wranglers who furnished the horses for the campers to ride. And they said they would take care of Prince. And so my daddy had him taken over in a trailer and, and taken to the Wranglers. And then I was appointed the assistant horseback riding instructor for camp. Oh, I loved that role. And so I rode on every trail ride. And I helped the kids and helped to be sure they were getting on right and getting off right and doing everything right as we rode along. And I absolutely loved being the assistant horseback riding instructor. Now, there was one problem with the camp that year. We liked the old camp, being back in that old camp again. But this time, there were chiggers. There were so many chiggers on the ground, and we all just got infested with chigger bites. And what we had to do was every night, each of us had to go to the nurse's cabin, take off our clothes, and let her put medicine on all our chigger bites so we could get some sleep. And I remember that some of the younger campers seemed to get the most bites. And I felt so sorry for some of those little girls who were at camp for the first time, and they were trying so hard, but they were just getting covered in chigger bites. And I felt so sorry for them. And so I came up with a plan. Why didn't we start making the best of it? And we could have a chigger queen crowned at the end of the camp, and she would be the one who had the most chigger bites. And so I got the nurse to start keeping a tally on how many chigger bites she she medicated for each of the kids. We counselors didn't bother, of course, to get involved with that. But we had all the campers, the younger campers, going to the nurse's cabin every night, and she would count the number of chigger bites they had as she put medication on them, and she kept a tally on each one of them. And I announced that we would have a chigger queen the last night of camp, and she would receive many good prizes. And the chigger queen would be the one who had the most chigger bites. So that really did help. It was easy. The little kids felt it was easier on them knowing that they might get to be the chigger queen. And I went to the businesses in Glenrose and got every business to donate something. And they were very generous. I remember one donated a camera, a nice camera. And so I got all these prizes for the Chigger Queen and wrapped them up and got them hidden away. And so, sure enough, the last night of camp, I can't remember whether it was before or after we had our ceremonial where we gave out the awards, but we definitely had a ceremony crowning the Chigger Queen. And the nurse had added up the tally, and only the nurse knew who had had the most chigger bites. And my group and I, my campfire group, and we were all in one cabin. We had built a throne and decorated it and had a thing leading up to it, and all sorts of decorations around it. On the pavilion, there was a pavilion in the center of the campground where we had our evening programs each night. And so we decorated it for preparation for the Chigger Queen. And that night we had this ceremony, and the nurse announced the girl with the most chigger bites, and she was brought forward and led up to the throne. And I was thrilled pink that it was a little girl who had had some kind of deformity and was a little slightly crippled. And she had tried so hard to keep up with everything at camp, and she had had such trouble with the chigger bites. And I was so happy she was the one that won. And so she was led up to the throne, and we put a crown on her head. And then we gave her these gifts. And of course, she was thrilled to pieces to get all those gifts. And so that was a lot of fun. And that's just about all I remember about that year of camp, except one other thing is coming to my mind. Vera Mangum, who was one of the leaders of the Campfire Girls, gave our group a series of magazine stories that she said she wanted us to read during the camp, to pass it around and for everybody to read and to discuss. And those articles were about sororities in colleges and how harmful some sororities were. And we read about those, and then we talked about them. And this was exactly what I had been concerned about, because I had already heard some tales about sororities being so hurtful to some girls. And these articles gave all these examples of girls being hurt in sororities. And it just made me feel more and more that I did not want to be in a sorority. I was not interested in the social life that there would be in a sorority. I didn't care about going to dances and having lots of parties. I wanted to go to college to get a good education. And that was my main purpose, and I just was not interested in this social life that the sorority offered. They acted like that was the only thing about going to college was the social life in the sorority, and that afterwards, from then on, you had these sorority sisters whom you would keep in touch with. Well, those were some of the women in Cleburne who had been trying to get me to be interested in their sorority. There were several women who had gone to college several years earlier, and they would try to influence me to come out for their sorority. And there were so many of them and competing, and it just got to where it irritated me. And I felt like they were wanting me in their sorority because they wanted to get favors from my daddy. I felt that that was what it was. And I just didn't care for all that emphasis on social life and partying. And these articles that we were asked to read at camp told of many examples where sororities had actually been harmful to some girls. So that just made me feel more like I did not want to join a sorority. But I thought, how can I go to the University of Texas? Because these people kept pushing me to join a sorority, and it would be the hardest thing to go and not join a sorority. So I was getting really worried about it. And so after school was out, as I said, after we graduated, the first thing was going to Campfire Girls Camp. And that's when we read these articles about how harmful sororities could be in some instances. And we talked a lot about it. And we all decided we didn't want to be in a sorority. And then the camp ended, and my daddy sent a trailer over to pick up Prince and brought him back. And I think it was about a week after we got back, I got back from camp. Daddy came in to tell me the terrible news that Prince had been foundered by those wranglers. They had let him eat too much of some foods, and he had become foundered. And he died a few weeks after I got back from camp. Well, I was absolutely heartbroken, and I knew it was all my fault because I had taken him to camp to show off and to be the assistant horseback instructor, and I had ruined his life and caused him to die, and I was absolutely heartbroken. I still just cry just thinking about it. And it was just so terrible. But the next thing I was scheduled to do was to go to a statewide Christian Endeavor conference in Dallas. I did not want to go at all. I was feeling so sad. But I was scheduled to go, and I was expected, and people were calling me about it, and I was an officer in the statewide Christian Endeavor, and I just had to go. And so I went. And I remember the first night we had a sermon by Dr. Curry. Now, Dr. Curry was an elderly minister at that time. He was considered the leading minister in the southern branch of the Presbyterian Church. And afterwards, I went up to him and told him that I remembered when my daddy went to the University of Texas that he had stayed in a dormitory at the seminary. There was a seminary attached to the University of Texas, and the seminary had closed for the war. But the dormitories were being used by UT students. And my father and his roommate, Bill Hester, had stayed in one of the dormitories at the seminary. And Dr. Curry was a young minister then, and he was in charge of that dormitory. And my daddy had gotten to love Dr. Curry. And I remember Dr. Curry gave Daddy a testament, a New Testament, which I still have. So I told Dr. Curry that now he was an elderly minister. But I told him about what my father had told me about him and how my father still appreciated him. And he remembered Daddy. And it helped me so much to talk to Dr. Curry. So, the next big evening program that we had was Hoyt Bowles preaching. Now, Hoyt had just come to the Hemphill Presbyterian Church in Fort Worth. He had come from a church in West Texas. And he preached to us such a stirring sermon that night that he helped me overcome all of that hurt I had been feeling about the loss of my horse. And I was so inspired by what he said. And at the end of his sermon, he invited everyone who wanted to dedicate their lives to working in Christian service to come forward. Well, I was so inspired that I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And I went forward that night and dedicated my life to full-time Christian service. And I remember while I was in Dallas, I was staying with a woman from Cleveland. And she was kind of an alarmist, but she was a nice lady. She phoned my mother. She had been at the service where we had this dedication and saw me going up to the front. So she called my mother that night and said that I had promised to become a missionary and that I would be going to Africa as a missionary. Well, my mother said, well, we'll just see when she comes home, and I'll let her tell me about it. My mother refused to get upset about it. Thank goodness. And so actually, that just meant that I wanted to work in a church as like a director of Christian education in a church. Women were not allowed to be ministers then. Now, I don't know if I would have tried to be a minister or not. I might have. But I decided that I just wanted to be a director of Christian education in a church and work in the Sunday schools and work with the various groups in the church, the youth program and so forth. So that was what I did, and by then I was getting more and more over the hurt that I had from the loss of my horse. And I did go back home then and tell my parents about it and what I had decided. And they were very proud of me and said they were thankful that I had made this decision, and they, knew I would go well and all, and they were just so supportive and so wonderful. And then the next thing that was scheduled that summer was summer conference for young people to be held at Trinity University. And we would live in the dormitory and have the use of the whole campus. Well, I was thrilled with that opportunity by then. And so I went to the conference, and I still remember the two things that were my favorite events of the day. One was Vespers every night when we walked over to the football stadium and climbed up in the bleachers. And Skipper Wilbanks, who was the director of the camp, would stand in front of the bleachers and give us a talk, inspiring us. And I was so inspired by those talks. And I loved Skipper Wilbanks. And the other thing that I loved about that conference was every evening we in the dormitory, after we got into our pajamas and got ready for bed, we gathered on the bed of our counselor. And we had a counselor for every part of the dormitory. And she would sit there with us in our pajamas, and we would just talk about things that bothered us, that we were worried about. And she would give us such good thoughts, good healthy thoughts. And then she would have us pray. We would have sentence prayers. Each one of us would say a little prayer, and she would say a prayer with us. And those evenings in the beds were just so meaningful to me. And I still remember our leader. It was Mrs. Spivey. And I can remember years later, I met her husband and I got to tell him how much those sessions had meant to me when his wife was leading, and I think he appreciated that. So that conference was really very meaningful to me. And there were some fun times. We would have fun at the meals. And I remember Hoyt Bowles was there. And he would do crazy things. He would act like a gorilla and climb on the pipes in the basement where we were having our meals. And he was just, he'd cut up. Well, I better get a drink. And I remember one night, he was in his car over by the dormitory, and kids were getting in his car to go somewhere with him. So I went along and got in the car. I had no idea where we were going. And he drove over to the home of his wife's sister, who lived in Waxahachie, and it wasn't far from the college. He drove over there. She wasn't even expecting us, and he came in, brought all of us in there, and we sat around in that living room, and bless her heart, she found refreshments to serve to us. And we had so much fun sitting there in her living room with Hoyt cutting up. And so that was one of the fun things we had. But I remember the last night when Skipper Wilbanks gave the last Vesper talk, and he asked then for people to come forward who wanted to dedicate their lives to full-time Christian service. So I went forward again and did my dedication there. And I came home and told my parents all about how much that it meant to me, and even how I had loved living in the dormitory at Trinity. So I told them all of this. And then I think that was in July, and at the beginning of August, I began to decide that I had to go to Trinity if I was going to prepare for this life of working in the church. And I couldn't go to the University of Texas like my father had planned all my life. And I remember going to my parents and telling them that I wanted to change plans and go to Trinity. And I think they must have been expecting that was going to happen. They didn't seem surprised at all. And my father was just as good as gold. I know it hurt him terribly that I wasn't going to UT, and he already had me registered there and in the dorm and all. But I told him I just couldn't go there. And they did not have the atmosphere that I wanted. And I wanted to study things that would help me prepare for Christian service. And I could only do that at Trinity. And he was just as understanding as could be, even though I knew he was hurt and disappointed. So this was already into August, and school started the 1st of September. But Trinity was so small in those days, and they didn't have enough students, and they were low on money, and they were glad to get anybody they could. And so my parents had no problem at all getting me registered that late to enter Trinity the 1st of September, and just about 2 or 3 weeks from there. And my mother signed me up in the dormitory and corresponded with someone to see who I could have for a roommate. And I was given the name and address of a girl whom I would have as a roommate. And we wrote to her, and my mother wrote to her mother, and all that was done at the end of August. And I entered Trinity the 1st of September. I'm starting to cry again just thinking about it. And how hard this must have been on my parents, and how wonderful they were. And so I got my room in the dormitory. And I started joining every club I could on the campus. And there was a club for ministerial students. And as girls could not be ministers, they were still allowed to join that club of future ministers if they were planned to work in the church in Christian education. So I got to join that club. And that club had an upper room. It was a small room on the top floor of the administration building that the club had turned into a small chapel. And every morning before class, club members met there, and one member of the class, of the club, would lead a devotional each morning. They took turns. And I can remember when I saw Ernest Dimlin giving a devotional there, I first noticed his voice, and I thought, what a great voice he has. And then I liked what he was saying, and I liked the way he looked. And I decided that he was the best of all the ministerial students. If I was getting to choose one of all the ministerial students in that club, I decided that Ernest Dimlin was the best one. And I remember that some people said that the girls that got in that club were just trying to get a preacher as a husband. Well, I never thought of it that way. I just thought of having my career as a Christian education director in church and working with ministers. But I sure was impressed with that Ernest Dimlin. And I remember that before I go on about that, I should say that as freshmen at Trinity, we were hazed something awful at that time. Now, the next year they stopped that hazing because it had gotten pretty extreme the year I was there. But we were just hazed something awful the first 6 weeks of school. And I remember that my mother actually got concerned about the way they were treating us. One time they put some solution on my hair that I couldn't get out. And when I went home for the weekend, my mother took me to a beauty shop, and they had a real hard time getting that stuff out of my hair. And my mother got upset about that. But mainly what they did was have us memorize crazy little poems. And they would stop us as we were walking through the campus and have us lie down on the concrete walk and recite that crazy poem. And then some of them would come in our rooms at night and make us get up in the middle of the night and recite that crazy poem. And we had to wear these silly little caps all the time. So we all looked silly. And we weren't allowed to speak to a boy. Not allowed at all to speak to a boy, much less have a date with a boy for these first 6 weeks. And I remember one night when, first I should say, the dormitory was an old building, and we had mice in our room. And my roommate and I each put a trap under our bed to catch the mice. And we had caught some and reset the trap again, each of the traps under our bed. And one night the sophomores came around and ordered us to get up out of bed and to recite the poem when we were half asleep. And while they were ordering that, they heard a noise coming down the hall. It was the house mother. Now, they were not supposed to be walking through the dorm after 10 o'clock and were not supposed to bother anybody after then, much less wake anybody up in the middle of the night. So they heard her coming and they knew they were going to get into trouble. And so both of these girls climbed under our beds to hide when the house mother came in. They ordered us to get back in our beds and act like nothing had happened. And they got under the beds. And the house mother came in. And she started asking us if they had been in there. And all of a sudden, one of the girls touched a mouse trap and caught her fingers in it and let out a yell. That was the funniest thing. And so the house mother looked under the bed and saw her. And so then she looked under the other bed and saw the other girl. And of course she had them up and scolded them, and they got into a lot of trouble. I don't remember what happened to them, but they sure got scolded in our room. And we were so happy that we had had those mouse traps, because that's what alerted the house mother that they were there. That was the funniest thing. So, after the 6 weeks, there was a meeting of all the girls in school, and it was announced that they were going to give the names of the girls who had been the best sports in the hazing, and that meant that they would be admitted to the Spurs. They would become members of the Spurs. Well, the Spurs were closest to a sorority of anything at Trinity, but they were mainly a organization to support the football team and to cheer them on. But they also did a lot of good work, charity work too. And being a spur was her great honor. And the part that was like a sorority was that once you were elected to the Spurs, you were always a spur. And you would have spur friends for the rest of your life. And sure enough, when they announced that, I thought, oh, if I could just be a spur. And sure enough, when they announced the names, I was one chosen to be a spur. And sure enough, I have continued to get letters from other spurs around the country until just a few years ago. So it was true that once a spur, you were always a spur, and you always helped any other spur that needed help. So I was so proud to be elected a spur. I remember calling my mother right afterwards. I was just so thrilled. And on Sunday nights, I went to the youth meeting at the church. Of course, we went to Sunday school on Sunday morning at the church. And then we went to youth meeting there on Sunday nights. And someone from the church would drive over and pick us up. There would be several cars that would come to pick us up and take us because it was quite a distance to the church. And so at those Sunday evening meetings, and also at the club meetings of the future ministers, I began to see more and more of that Ernest Dimlin and become more and more impressed with him. And I started talking to him on Sunday nights after the youth meeting. And he invited me to walk home with him. And that walk took about 30 or 40 minutes if you walk slowly, because it was quite a distance. And we would talk and talk all the way we walked, and learning more and more about each other and about what we thought about things. And I was more and more impressed all the time. And so after he had walked me home a few times, I called a lady I knew from Cleburne who was working in the same building which I had learned Ernie was working as a janitor to help pay for his college education. And so I phoned her and told her that I was interested in the neatest boy. And I was so excited about him. And she told me, Margaret, stop being so excited about him and don't count on any attention from him again, because she said she noticed that he had a big crush on a cute little blonde that worked in that office, and she thought it was fairly serious. And he would leave notes to that little cute little blonde girl. So she said, I'm pretty sure that he's pretty serious about her and that I should not count on him paying attention to me. Well, that just made me more determined than ever to catch that boy. Now, I wasn't thinking ahead of far enough to like to marry him, but I was thinking ahead to go with him, to have dates with him and get to know him better. That's what I wanted to do. And when she told me that I shouldn't try, that just made me try harder. I was determined to get attention from him, and more attention than just those walks home on Sunday night. And I remembered in years past, some ministerial students from Trinity had come to our church in Cleburne and put on a program on Sunday nights. And I thought, that's what I'll do. I'll organize a group of people from that club of ministerial students, and including Ernie, and invite them to come to the church in Cleburne to put on a program. And I planned it all about who would do what on the program. And I knew that if I had students put on that program, my parents would invite us to supper. Bless their hearts, they always invited my friends from out of town who came to have meetings in Cleburne or put on programs. They always invited them for a supper, and I knew I could count on that. So I organized this program and got somebody in the group had a car who would drive us to Cleburne, and I organized what each person would do on the program, and they all agreed, and it was a good experience for the ministerial students. And then I got approval with my parents for us to have a Sunday night service in the church. And we drove over to Cleburne and put on our program, and sure enough, my parents invited us then to the house for a supper. And I was so proud of my parents that night. It seemed that they just went out more so than ever to show my friends a good time. And they had such a wonderful supper, and they just did everything. And we stayed there quite a while that evening. And I remember that my daddy kind of embarrassed me by showing the home movies that he had made, but they seemed to enjoy that. And my mother she and Lula had prepared this wonderful supper for us. And I can remember seeing Ernie back in the kitchen with my mother and laughing with her. And I thought, oh, how great, he's getting along so good with my mother. And then I remember him having a talk with my father, and that made me feel so good. And I just felt that meeting had been a big success. Well, sure enough, when we got back to Waxahachie, from then on, Ernie started inviting me very often to go on walks. During the week, he would come to my dorm room. My dorm was on the first floor on a corner of the building, and kids would walk up to it and talk to us, my roommate and I, through the window. And Ernie would do that, and he would ask me to come take walks with him several times during the week. And we would walk down to the city park and sit there on the park bench and just talk and talk. Of course, he didn't have a car. We couldn't go anywhere or do anything, but we loved talking to each other. And he just kept asking me more often than ever. And I remember my daddy sending me a copy of a letter that he had received from the Trinity registrar whom he had gotten acquainted with. And it said, Margaret is going with an older boy. It didn't give his name at all. Margaret's going with an older boy, and he is a bad influence on her. And I think she needs to stop going with him. And he is causing her grades to go down, and her grades are dropping. And that was the letter that he sent to my father. And my father also sent me a copy of his response. And he said, we have gotten acquainted with Ernest. See, he gave his name. We've gotten acquainted with Ernest, and we think he's a very fine young man. And I know that Margaret needs to bring up her grades, and I will speak to her about them, and I'm sure she will bring them up. He didn't say a word about me not seeing Ernie. And he's a very fine young man. He said, oh, that thrilled me to death. And of course I did get busy. I told Ernie I had to turn him down sometime. Couldn't take quite as many walks with him because I had to bring my grades back up to please my parents. And so sure enough, I brought my grades back up, and I kept seeing Ernie. And that was a very important part of my freshman year. Then, going back a little ways, I remember when December the 7th happened. I had taken 2 girlfriends home for the weekend, and we had not even had the radio on, and had not heard any news. We didn't get much national news in Cleburne anyway, but we had not heard any news. And Mother took us back just in time to go to the youth meeting at the church that night. And they were talking about something that we could hardly believe had happened, that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese. It was unbelievable. And then the next morning, we were told that President Roosevelt was going to speak to the nation that morning, and that we were asked to come and sit on the steps of the administration building, which had tall steps, and they would have a radio on there for us to listen to President Roosevelt speak. He was going to give an important talk to the nation, and we were all supposed to listen. So we all got there and sat on the steps. And I'm starting to cry again. That's when we heard the president declare war on Japan. And he said our nation had to prepare for war. And right afterwards, all of the boys started saying they were going into the service. They were quitting school and going into the service. And they all tried to do it. And Ernie said when he went, they told him that ministers, that chaplains were going to be needed in the Army. And so it was important for some of these ministerial students to go on and finish their education and become ministers so they could be chaplains in the Army. So he was not allowed even to enter the service because of that. But most of the other boys I knew that I had become friends with in my classes just quit school right then and entered the Army or the Navy. And I had still been corresponding with those two boys who had been my boyfriends when I had gone to that Christian Endeavor conference in Colorado. David, who had gone up with us in the car, and Eddie, whom I had met at the conference. And I still corresponded with both of them. And they both entered the service. One entered the Navy and one the Army. And I kept writing to them. And actually, I wrote to them until I became engaged to Ernie. And then I felt I had to stop. Okay, so that was very sad, that spring semester, as everybody, all the boys nearly were leaving, and only the ministerial students were left in Trinity. Thank goodness there were quite a few of those. So those are the main things I remember about my first year at Trinity. And I loved all of my courses, every one of them. And I took 2 Bible courses, and I especially loved those. And I just felt that everything I was taking and experiencing was helping to prepare me for a life of full-time Christian service. In our upper room with our daily devotionals and in our uh, club meetings with the ministerial students, and then our activities at the church in Waxahachie, and all of that just kept pointing in that direction. And the atmosphere on the campus was a Christian atmosphere, and it just seemed like everything was church oriented on the campus, and I just loved it all. It made me very sad that most of the guys had to leave that spring semester, but otherwise, I just loved that first year at Trinity. And the best part of all was getting to know and have attention from Ernest Dimlin. And I remember at some point, and I can't remember when it was some time after that, Ernie told me that before he went to Cleburne with that group to put on that program at the church and went to my parents' home, before that, he had been very serious about that cute little blonde, even though he had started walking home with me from church, from youth meeting. But he was very serious about that cute little girl. He didn't call her that cute little girl, he gave her a name. And one time she had taken him to her home. She lived in Waxahachie. And he said that her mother was a big fat slob. She had a cigarette dangling out of her mouth, and the house was a complete wreck. And then, shortly after that, he had gone to my parents' home with the group that presented the program at our church. And my parents were completely different. They had a very nice home, not luxurious, but very attractive and well kept. Everything proper and clean and nice. And my parents, he thought, were just wonderful. He was so impressed with my father, and he loved my mother. And he said she was completely different from the mother of that girl he had been going with. And he realized, he said, that girl and I would probably grow up to be something like our mothers. And he did not want to have anything to do with a woman like her mother. And he liked my mother so much. He just thought my mother was the loveliest woman he had been around. And so that is what had caused him then to start spending a lot more time with me and asking me to go on walks much more often. So I credited my mother with saving Ernie from me, saving me from that other cute little girl. It was my mother and what he thought of her as well as my father that caused him to give up that other little girl completely and start spending as much time as he could with me. And I was so grateful to my parents, I didn't know what to do. And at the end of that school year, Ernie got a job at Fort Sam Houston as a teletype operator. And he was working long hours, working very hard. But when he had a chance, he would write long letters to me. That summer, he kept writing these long letters to me. I hope I still have those letters. I had them for a long time. And I hope they didn't get thrown away. But he would tell me about books he had read, about his ideas about everything, what he believed about everything. These long letters. And I would try to answer them. And I felt so inadequate in a lot of ways because I had not done near the reading that he had. And he was 9 years older than me. And he had had so many more experiences in life than I had had. But I loved those letters he sent that summer. And I could remember every time I was expecting one, I would stand outside looking for the postman, looking down the street to see when I saw him coming. And I remember Mr. Singletary, the postman, he would come by and he'd say, "You expecting a letter from that boy?" "Well, there's not one here." Sometimes he would tease me and not give it to me till he got ready to leave. But he always stopped at our house and talked to me and teased me. And, oh God, I love those letters. And I remember I guess it was near the end of the summer, I can remember lying out in our hammock at night and playing romantic music on the radio. I had a little radio, and we would play that music. I would play that music, and I remember my daddy coming out there and saying, "Are you thinking about that boy?" And I would say yes. And he said, "Well, just pray about it. You will know what to do. You will be led with what to do." And I believed him, and of course that was true. So, something that I had forgotten to say about Trinity. The school was running out of money that year that I was at Trinity in Waxahachie. and they had tried to get Dallas to support them, and they couldn't get that support. And they knew they had to get help somewhere. And I remember that our minister was hired to go to Presbyterian churches in our branch all around Texas, asking them to help with Trinity, to help support Trinity. But there simply was not enough money to keep Trinity in Waxahachie. And San Antonio had wanted a 4-year college so bad. And they had a campus of an old college. I guess it was a 2-year college. An old college that had been there before and closed. And they offered that campus to Trinity temporarily until they could build new buildings on a new campus, and that San Antonio would help them get a new campus and build new buildings on it. So all that Trinity could do was to accept that invitation. And we heard about it right at the end of school that first year, and we were heartbroken because we had loved being in Waxahachie and loved that old campus and all those buildings. We just didn't want to leave it, but it had to be. And so Trinity moved to San Antonio that summer and took that old campus from that old school temporarily. And the faculty and the students had to decide whether they were going to make the move to San Antonio or not. About half of the faculty went. Both of the deans went, but not the president. And like I said, about half of the faculty did not go. And so a new president was hired for Trinity. New people, new business manager, and new people in all the roles that were not filled by people moving from Waxahachie. And the student body was the same. I think about half decided to make the move, and the others didn't. And I was one that decided to make the move. Now, I'm sure I was partly influenced because Ernie lived in San Antonio. But also, I just wanted to continue being a part of Trinity. And I wanted to help with the move, to help move the spirit, the wonderful spirit we had had on the Waxahachie campus, to help move that spirit to the new campus in San Antonio. I wanted to be a part of all of that. And so I decided to go to Trinity in San Antonio. And I remember in August, there was a statewide Christian Endeavor convention in San Antonio. And in my office, I had to set up an exhibit of things, ways to interest others in joining Christian Endeavor. And I had this exhibit which I set up, and Ernie came to see me and helped me set it up and all. And I went to that conference and just got a little inkling of being in San Antonio. And then I went back home till time to go for Trinity. And my parents took me down and got me a room in the dormitory. Now, the dormitory in this old campus was quite nice, and it was much better than the dormitory we had had in Waxahachie. I had just loved that old dormitory. But this one was much nicer, and my parents felt good about it, and they had me signed up for a room in there. And then I did whatever else was needed to enroll in classes in San Antonio. And I went down there then when the school opened and got started going to Trinity. Now, the only other building on the campus besides that dormitory was an administration building with a lot of classrooms and a auditorium and a dining hall. All of that in that one building. Excuse me. So that was where we started to school. And I remember in the very beginning, the most that I remember, the first month or two that I was in San Antonio, I mainly remember Ernie and his friend Ed Polk taking me around places. Now, Ed was in the Army, but he was stationed in San Antonio, and he had a car. And he and Ernie would come and pick me up, and they would drive me around and show me all of the points of interest in and around San Antonio. It was the most wonderful experience. And I would be sitting in the front seat with those two guys. In those days, the cars did not have bucket seats in the front, and 3 people sat in the front, and we didn't have to have seat belts. So 3 people always sat in the front seat, and I sat there between those 2 boys, and I was having the time of my life And they drove me around to see every point of interest. And it seemed like every day that I could get off, they would take me somewhere. And I had the best time with those guys. And I remember one time on a Saturday night, they took me down to the market square. And there was a big bonfire, and a Mexican band was playing, and people were dancing and singing and having a great time around that bonfire. And the Chili Queens were there. Now, the Chili Queens were women dressed in colorful Mexican dresses with big pots of chili, and they would dip up chili into smaller bowls and sell those little bowls. I remembered back when our family had come on vacation to San Antonio years earlier, and there were Chili Queens at the Alamo selling chili, and I wanted to get some, and my mother wouldn't let us get some. She said she was afraid it wasn't sanitary. Well, she was right. About that time that Ed and Ernie were taking me down there, Life magazine did an expose of the Chili Queens and found there were roaches in their chili. Well, San Antonio, of course, got very upset about it, and the city ordered all the Chili Queens to quit selling and to quit bringing their chili to the Alamo and to the farmers market. Well, there were still a few of those Chili Queens that were coming anyway on Saturday night to the farmers market. And I got to see them there, and I had heard about the roaches in the chili, but I saw they were still serving it. And then I remember Ed and Ernie took me into a tiny little cafe just off of the end of the market where the big bonfire was. They took me there. It was such a little place. I think it just had about 4 tables. And they ordered tacos for us. Well, I had never heard of tacos before. And when ours came and I started to eat mine, Ed said it had roaches in it, like the chili. Well, of course I got upset, and then he admitted he was teasing. And that he said that he had been back in the kitchen of this place and had talked to the people. They had just recently come from Mexico and opened this up, and their kitchen was very clean. And they were very clean, nice people. So he said it was perfectly safe to eat the tacos. He had just been teasing me. So that was the beginning of going to that place. And many times afterwards, Ernie took me to that little place, and it kept growing, kept getting bigger and bigger. And eventually, that tiny place with the 4 tables grew into the restaurant meaty era, which became the most popular restaurant in San Antonio. And they had started back when I was starting to Trinity in San Antonio. They had started there with about 4 tables. So it was a wonderful family and wonderful food. And they had their, oh, when they were big enough to have waitresses, they had them dressed like the chili queens in very colorful Mexican dresses. So that was the place I had enjoyed going most with Ed and Ernie. But I remember another time after that when Ed took a date. Now, I think this was the only time he took a date with us. Most of the time, I had those 2 guys to myself, and I just felt so lucky. But he had this real pretty girl as a date. And of course, she sat in the front seat with him, so Ernie and I sat in the back seat. And Ed drove us out along the Guadalupe River, out from town, to a real pretty place to have a picnic. And he had taken a picnic supper for us. And we had our picnic, and it was so nice there. And the river was very shallow, and it was so pretty. The water looked crystal clear, and I just had to get into the water. Just had to get my feet in there. So I took off my shoes and the socks, and I started wading around in the water and just enjoying it so much. And then I stepped on some glass and cut my foot, and it started bleeding quite a bit. Well, I wasn't worried about it. It just seemed like something small, and I was having such a good time wading in the river. And I just kept on and didn't let it bother me. And that pretty little girl was complaining about things. She complained about everything. And I just thought, I'm certainly not going to complain about things. And that wasn't my nature to do that anyhow. So I kept walking around, and my foot was bleeding quite a bit. And finally Ed stopped me, and he insisted on looking at my foot. And he said, "We've got to take you to the doctor." And I said, "Oh, it's not that important. I don't need to go to a doctor. I can just wrap it up and with a handkerchief or something, and I'll be all right." He said, "No, we've got to take you to a doctor." And so they drove me to a doctor, and both of those guys took me inside to the doctor. And that pretty girl that Ed was with was still complaining about things. And of course they just left her in the car, and they went in with me and stayed with me while the doctor saw me. And he took some stitches in my foot and then gave me a tetanus shot. And of course, he wrapped a bandage on it and all. And it did hurt, but I was determined not to complain about it, and I didn't. And Ed never dated that girl again because he was tired of her complaining, he said. So I was thankful that I had not been a complainer. And then back to Trinity. I was so interested in trying to help develop the same wonderful spirit on this campus that we had had in Waxahachie. I need to stop and get a drink. Right, I can continue on now. So I was so interested in trying to develop this Trinity spirit again at this new campus. And I talked to some of the others, and there were some new ministerial students there who had not been going to Trinity, but had gone to other schools in the beginning and were transferring to Trinity. And I remember one of those boys seemed especially interested in developing a Christian spirit at Trinity. Now, I should say, Ernie was so busy earning money then in order to keep going in college that he was not able to participate much on the campus then, like he had done in Waxahachie. So I remember this other boy who was going to be a minister. And he was also interested in developing this Christian spirit on the campus. And we got together with a few other kids and decided to form an organization which would be a YWYMCA, a combined men's and women's Christian organization. So we did that, and this other fellow, Ed, and I were elected co-presidents of the organization. And I told Ed about the upper room we had had in Waxahachie, and he thought that sounded so great. And so we went to see the president, Ed and I. Trinity had this new president. He was from the north, and he acted like he didn't understand Texas, and he didn't understand Trinity. and we were terribly disappointed in him. But we went to him and asked him for a room that we could use to convert into a little chapel for our upper room to have our devotions every day. And he would not give us one. And I got so upset that he didn't give us one. And then I remember sometime later in the year, my little sister, we had, in the dormitory, they had assigned a little sister to each of the sophomore girls. And I had a little sister whom I helped to get used to college and get used to being in the dorm. She was a real sweet girl. And she came to me and said that she had started taking speech and that the professor said he wanted them to put on a play. It would be a play given to the public. And he showed them the book of the play and said that they would start giving out the cast members and start practicing for it, and it would be very important. Well, my little sister was upset because she said in the play there was a lot of bad language, and they started talking about sex, and there was just and drinking and things like that, and she was very upset about it. She had come from a very conservative home like I had, and so I agreed with her that that was not a good thing for Trinity to be putting on when we were trying to develop a spirit completely different from that on the campus. And they were doing this for the public, and people in San Antonio would be able to see it. And that was not the kind of reputation that we wanted Trinity to have. So I decided that I would go and talk to the speech teacher who was leading this play. I had taken speech my freshman year in Waxahachie and had liked the teacher and had gotten along well with him. And so I went to see him, and I told him what my little sister had said, and that I had looked at that part of the play, and that I did not think it was appropriate for Trinity to be giving a play with scenes like that, and especially giving it to the public. That was not the kind of reputation we wanted Trinity to have. And I told him this, and he got furious with me. And he said I had no right to tell him what to do in his class. And he said that he could have me expelled for trying to influence or trying to tell him what to do in his class. And he was just furious and he stormed out of the room. Well, I was kind of worried about it. I didn't know what he would do about me. And I just remember worrying so about it. And the very next, right after that, I decided to go to Dean Schwab. I had known Dean Schwab for years because he used to preach in our church when the minister was not there. And he had even had dinner in our home. So I felt I knew him well. And I went to him and told him how I was concerned about the play and what the professor had said to me and that I was worried about it. And he said, he just sat there very calmly and very quietly. And he said, well, I will talk to the president about it. Well, the very next day, I was given word that I was to come to a meeting in the president's office at a certain time that afternoon. And I was scared to death. And I went to the meeting. And in the room, the speech teacher was sitting on one side of the president, and Dean Schwab was sitting on the other side of him. And this president, who was not interested in developing a Christian atmosphere in Trinity, evidently, was there in the middle. And there were 2 or 3 other students that I did not know, that they had just come to Trinity. They were ministerial boys who were ministerial students, and they were like seniors in college, and they were there. And then I sat next to them. And the president started by saying that Dean Schwab had come to him and said there was concern about a play that was being considered. And he wanted to hear what each one of us had to say about it. And he started around the room, starting with these boys, and having each one of them speak and say what they were concerned about. And they talked about the things that they had heard about in the thing, the bad language and the sex talk and all. And that they did not think that Trinity ought to do that. And each one of them said things like that. And the president asked if they had read the play. No, they hadn't read it. They had just been told about it, they said. And they said other ministerial students had told them about it. And I could see that speech teacher just fuming over there. And then it was my turn to speak. And I said pretty much what I had told the teacher, that that I had that my little sister had come